This lesson is going to be looking at factoring when the polynomial you're factoring this time has a coefficient in front of the x squared. It's not just going to be 1x squared anymore, it can be anything. So before we get started with this, notice it does say guess and check. When I recall learning factoring, I personally detested factoring because that was, as far as I can remember, the only way I was ever taught. I was only ever taught guess and check. So, notice I say the only way I was taught. There are numerous other ways to factor, and I will teach you those as we progress throughout the factoring unit. So, let's take a look and recall what we've learned so far. If we have a polynomial x squared minus 7x plus 12, the first term is always going to be x because x squared, the only way you can get it is x times x. And then this tells us we're looking for two numbers that multiply to make 12. So our choices are 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. This sign tells us that our signs are going to be the same. And then this tells us that they're both negative. So it's going to be x minus something and x minus something. So we're looking for the factors of 12, which we just discussed, that add together to make 7. So if we're looking at our choices, the ones that add together are 3 and 4. So we have x minus 3 times x minus 4. Now let's look into something a tad bit more complicated. Let's look into now, instead of having just x squared, we have 2x squared plus 11x plus 5. Still, the only way to get 2x squared is to multiply 2x times x, because the only way to get 2 is 1 times 2, right? So one of our first factors is going to be a 2x, and the second is going to be an x. Then we have to test the possible placements of 5. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply together to make 5, but they have to add together to make 11. And remember, this tells me that the both signs are going to be the same, and this tells me that both signs are going to be plus. So it's going to be 2x plus something and x plus something. And I'm looking for factors of 5, which the only way you can get it are 1 times 5, and they have to add together to make 11. But they're not adding together necessarily to make 11 in this case because you have the 2 out in front, so that plays something into the multiplication. So I have to check my factors of 5 and 1 and their placement. So the only way I could put it is I could say 2x plus 1, which would mean then the x would have to be plus 5. Or I could say that 2x plus 5, and then the x would have to be the plus 1. So in order to test it, you'd have to actually now go ahead and do the FOIL to see which one actually gave you 2x squared plus 11x plus 5. Which ends up being this one here, 2x plus 5 times x plus 1. Not so bad when you really only have two choices. However, things can get more complicated. Take this one, for example. I'm looking for, now I have 3x squared minus 4x minus 7. The only way to get 3x squared is so far 3x and x, just like it was before with the 2x squared. But I have now numbers that have to multiply to make 7. So I have 1 and 7 and 1 and 7. But the 7 is negative, right? And that means we have to subtract the ones in the middle eventually. So because we have to subtract and because it's negative, one of them is technically positive and one of them is technically negative, right? So we know that our signs tell us that as well, because this tells me that my signs are going to be different, and this tells me that my biggest one is going to be negative. So then I have to test the theory and test where the positive 1 and the negative 7 go, or where the negative 1 and the positive 7 go. So my two terms, the first terms are still 3x and x, but then I have 1 plus and 1 minus, so I could have 3x plus 1 and x minus 7. Or I could have 3x minus 1 and x plus 7. Or I could have 3x minus 7 and x plus 1. Or 3x plus 7 and x minus 1. So again, now we're getting more choices that we'd have to test. So your final result, without making you test it right now, is that one. If you were to FOIL it, you would get 3x squared minus 4x minus 7. Now we're looking at something becoming even more complicated, okay? Because our value of a is 6. There's two different ways to get 6. You can get 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. So our first factors can either be x and 6x or 2x and 3x. And then we're looking for numbers that multiply together to give me 15, which is either 1 and 15 or 3 and 5. And so I'd have to test the placements of those. Now that gives me 8 different possibilities of what could be the two binomials that multiply together to give me 6x squared plus 19x plus 15. Eventually, once you FOIL and once you guess and check, you will find out that it is this one here, 2x plus 3 times 3x plus 5, which gives you the value of 6x squared plus 19x plus 15. Now, think about this for a second. Think about how many more choices you would have had if this sign here would have been minus instead of plus. Because then you would have had, just like the previous example, where your multiplication had to be in a negative, so you'd have to have one of the terms being negative, so your signs would have been different, which would have probably doubled the number of choices you potentially could have had. I don't ever remember learning factoring any way that is different than this. Luckily, after you work with this for a little bit and understand the basics of what we're doing, I am going to show you in the next upcoming lessons ways to make this a lot less of a painful experience.